Please join me in welcoming Phil to filming.
Vegan testing, any applause is really a rarity, so thank you. So yeah, I run a group called Capital Educators. I got interested in test prep as far back as when I was in college, and did tutoring on the side then. Was in informal high school teaching for a bit, and then got sucked back into the world of test prep. I started Capital Educators in '97, and I've been running a program that continues to evolve since then. We're not that big a group. As we roll this morning, whenever you have questions, please, feel free to interrupt me mid-sentence. I don't mind at all. But I think talking about this topic at the end of 10th grade is pretty much perfect timing. Not because you have to push your student to get prepping immediately, but just so you can start to get a feel for the timeline and make a plan that works for you and your family. So here's where I thought I'd start. Nowadays, you can't really talk about the SAT without talking about the ACT. So we're going to be discussing the two of them primarily. And I thought rather than just kind of talking at you about these exams, that I would show you a sample question or two. This may bring back some unpleasant memories, but I think it's helpful in sort of assessing where these tests are moving and building some sympathy towards what our guys are going through. I'll give you a tiny bit of background about this question. This is an ACT problem that I took from near the end of a section. And the placement matters in that they organize those questions by difficulty. So this was one that over 80% of the country got wrong when it was administered. So it was meant to be on the harder side. So no pressure. Here it is. You can see it says if the edges of a cube are reduced to half their length to produce a new smaller cube, then the smaller cube's volume is what fraction of the original cube's volume? Right. Yeah, I've already heard 2 or 3 answers. This is good. Feels like fun. Let me ask you this. What answer choice do you think most 16, 17-year-old eyes are going to gravitate towards first? A. A, right? Okay. And I warned you though, right? I told you that this was supposed to have been a difficult question. And so one instinct we try to beat out of students early in the process is avoiding these kinds of trap answers. There were more of these kinds of choices back in the day when we took these things, many more. But the name for this through the years, we call them in the field Joe Blogg's answer choices because the average Joe always goes there. And so one of the first jobs when you're trying a harder question is to at least not be here. And I actually think there's one other choice here that has some blogsiness to it. If you don't pick one half, what else is wrong but maybe tempting? You guys are good. Okay? And by the way, once you've identified the traps, you're probably going to get it right. And I heard a couple of you, it's noted that you did get it right away. I heard E pretty quickly from a few. But the way we probably recommend students deal with this is rather than work, with an imaginary cube, that they make up a value for the side of the cube and they visualize it, that they plug in a number. And so when I was doing this on my own, I would make each side 2, and then I would cut each dimension in half, and then I can prove to myself that, yep, there's definitely a 1-to-8 ratio. Now, hard or easy? I mean, some of you are looking at me like, go away, I don't want to do any more math. But let's put that aside for now. Big picture, high school experience, there's no pre-calculus going on here, there's no calculus. Okay, so one really important fact. These exams, both the ACT and SAT, are designed to test sort of the foundational content that they're exposed to, mostly in middle school, 9th grade, and maybe 10th grade. And that's because they don't want the SAT to be an exam that's measuring one school's curriculum versus another, right? And they don't want to rule students out who aren't in the most advanced math track, okay? The most sophisticated math content on these exams gets into Algebra 2. Okay? You don't need to have mastered it, you don't need to have completed the whole year, but you want to at least be halfway through Algebra 2. So that sometimes impacts the timing when you want to think about sitting for these things. Let me show you one more math question, and I promise I'll stop. Okay. This was one that I found at the back of an SAT. An even higher percentage got this one wrong, okay? Like well over 90% got it wrong. And all they're really asking you to do is re-express that fractional expression to simplify it. Okay. Let's start with Joe Bloggs. Can anybody look at that? I already heard it. Why? Why would somebody jump to A? You're totally right. Okay, there you go. It's like, it just looks good. Here's the part that maybe you're not even realizing. I think when people see simplify, what's really tempting for a lot of people to do is to just look at those Y's and just cross them out. Right? It's cathartic, okay? It's not math, but it feels good. You're not allowed to do that. And the test writers are aware that temptation exists. And so a choice like A is Joe Bloggs. And a choice like B, I'd also say, is Joe Bloggs, because it too just kind of magically eliminates the Y's. 50-50 at this point. And one detail that might be worth knowing, okay, even if you don't plan to get deep into this with your kid, there's no more guessing penalty on any of these exams. You may vaguely remember this from when we took them. So we always want students to hazard a guess, even if it's a 1 in 4 or a 1 in 5 situation. Definitely 1 in 2, okay? And the payoff's pretty significant. On an SAT, a question that you get right is worth 10 points. So you can change your score pretty quickly. I think this question kind of gets at the essence of these tests, okay? Because here's the hope. The hope is that our sons actually remember how to do algebraic division. And if they do remember that, they will get to the right answer pretty quickly, okay? Much more naturally than we could. But where someone like me comes in is, all right, maybe you forgot how to do it because it was 3 years ago, or you're just a little underconfident, or you want to check your work. And so what I would do if I were uncertain is exactly what I did 2 minutes ago. Instead of dealing with algebra, I would make up a number for y and turn that expression into numbers. And so I not so creatively made y2. And I was like, okay, that original expression is going to be 12 minus 4 over 2 plus 5. And then, I don't mean to quiz you here, but how do you think we would find the answer? How would we match it up? This is the same enthusiasm I get on the other basis. My 11th graders. All I would do is take my 2, the number I just manufactured that I plugged in, and I would put it into C and D, and one of them will match up 8 sevenths. And that's how I'll know I got it right. Okay? It's not this one. This would be 6 minus 4 sevenths, 5 4 sevenths. It's going to be that. Okay. All right. Here's the big picture idea. Big picture, okay? You don't need to be in calculus to be ready for the tests, fine. But I think the more important idea is that the ACT and the SAT have never been dramatically different exams, okay? And in their current state, they're even less different than they were in the past. How many of you have had older ones go through this? Not too many. How many years ago?
Last year and the year before.
Okay, so they both are kind of in this world. But about 3 years ago, the SAT was redesigned, which is something that happens about every decade. And almost every single change that was made to the SAT made it more like this competitor test, the ACT. This was like a calculated business decision by the college. All right, and the upshot is, I think, a favorable one for our guys. Because it's nice to think you know which test is a better fit as a student. Like, it's great to know, I think I'm better at the SAT or I like the ACT. But you don't really have to know this up front anymore. because the reality is, if you study well for one of these exams, if you think you're an SAT person and you prep for the SAT, you will have inadvertently studied really well for the other one too. And so with increasing regularity, what more students are doing now, not all, but more, is staying open to the possibility of taking both tests, okay? Do colleges prefer one of these to the other? Have you heard? I'm getting shrugs from the veterans, so that's a good sign. They do not care, okay? Years ago, the ACT was much more rare in this part of the country, and East and West Coast students almost never took the exam. Nowadays, colleges are equally happy to evaluate either score, and they actually see almost the exact same number of SATs and ACTs nationally. It looks like a presidential election. It's like 50 to 49.7, okay? So you don't need to know which test to focus on, and there might be some real value in taking both for this reason. Even for schools that really value these scores, no institution requires you to send both. So if you study well, and you take both tests at the end of that process, and your ACT is much better than your SAT, you send that ACT off to all your schools, and what do you do with this? Okay, it's like it never happened. Or the reverse. And if you do really nicely on both, okay, if they're comparable and you're pleased with how they went, you can very happily and nerdily send both, that's fine. It's rarely going to make any difference at all to an admissions office except to say, I'm a consistent tester. Okay? So that might be the one overarching idea. You do not need to pick your poison in April of 10th grade. And we'll talk more about that as we go. Show you one listing. I want to show you one thing that's no longer on the test too, because I think this is an important thing to know. So this is a sentence completion question. These types of questions have been on the exam since the 60s, okay? Like we dealt with these when we took the test. They ask you a question. Hopefully you read that thing and you have an idea in your head what you want to put in the blank. Anybody have a good word to anticipate in there?
Authenticity.
Nice, authenticity. I would be even less creative, I'd say accuracy, okay? But here's something that may feel familiar to you. The words, right? Oh yeah, okay? These words are basically gone, okay? Not in the real world, okay? But it was decided in really, the SAT has changed. I've tutored 4 versions of the test since I've been doing this since the late 80s, okay? And each version has emphasized vocabulary less. So when we were kids, we either studied those words or didn't, but we were told we should, right? Now, these words are not on the exam at all, out of the idea that, you know what, these are not high usage words that people need to use. There's one type of question that's, by the way, do I answer?
Yeah.
All right, E. They have one type of question now that's pretty similar. There's not a lot of it on the test. Okay. So you have to decide whether that word works or if there's a better one. You sense a difference with the sophistication of the vocabulary. You need to have some precision with your words, but you do not need to be using words like loquacity. Okay. And this actually connects, I'll talk about this, but nowadays the verbal scores of these tests are really built around reading comprehension. So it kind of cuts both ways. On the one hand, the students love to hear that they don't need to memorize 700 words anymore, okay? Like that's a way to get popular in my position. But arguably, the test is a little more difficult to improve at because, right, improving your reading ability, okay, really requires rolling up your sleeves and working at it harder. and particularly a challenge if your sons are like mine, and maybe not super apt to just jump into a novel when they have a little weekend time. All right, to talk about the ACT and SAT in a little more detail without overloading you. Again, the big idea is that they're much more similar than different. And if I did throw a number at it, I'd say they're 85% similar, okay? And 15% different. The most obvious difference between the exams, and you guys, you totally have this slide in your handout. Yeah. But the biggest difference has to do with science. The ACT has had a separate, dedicated science section at the end of it, okay? The truth is that section is not really about knowing scientific facts. It's more about thinking scientifically. It's about interpreting graphs and tables and charts and really analyzing data, okay? It's typically the section students are the least comfortable with at first because it's pretty dense and it's hard to finish. But here's what the SAT has done in its own quiet way. It still doesn't have a science part, except it now sprinkles 36 science questions all over the test. So the science part of the SAT it doesn't feel quite as painful, but you're doing an analogous amount of work. On the reading, there are two of the passages are always scientific. On the math, the same graphs and tables and charts pop up. Point being, you don't want to pick a test based on either a love of science or a hatred of it. Like, you're going to have to deal with it one way or another. Math. The questions I chose deliberately for one reason. The ACT continues to be about 1/4 geometry, which probably doesn't surprise you. I mean, that seems about right. Except the SAT has almost eliminated geometry in its most recent form. There are only like 5 or 6 geometry questions on the whole test. The rationale is that if you go on to lead a life outside of the sciences and engineering, if you're not a STEM person, you become like a regular adult, okay? That you're more apt to use algebraic reasoning, probably, than geometry. Debatable, but that's the idea. Beyond that, the differences are pretty minimal, okay? Because there's more geometry, ACT, I'd argue, has like a greater breadth of content, but otherwise they're testing very similar things. And on both exams, there's kind of a mixed message with calculator use. Calculator use has varied on these tests forever. When we took the thing, you couldn't use a calculator, okay? Starting in the 90s, you always could use a calculator. And now it's a mixed bag. So on the SAT, there's a short section, about 1/3 of the test, that's no calc. And then a longer section, 2/3 of the test, where a calculator is allowed. On the ACT, you can always use a calculator in math, but you can never use a calculator in science. And I think I know what's going on with this. I feel like I've probably shared this in this room before, but I've taken the real SAT with high school kids, and on Saturday mornings, more than 36 times in my life. I have no hobbies, okay? It's getting kind of sad, because now they're like, old man, do you need a wider chair? But when you take one of these tests, and by the way, I don't do it purely because I'm strange. I'm doing it to try to see how the exam is evolving, and also to keep myself mentally in the game so that when I am tutoring kids, I have a little bit of credibility and I don't come off like we do as parents, When I was in high, they don't want to get that, right? But I bring it up because the second that a calculator section begins, the first thing you see and hear is the student immediately next to you whipping out, okay, his TI-84, okay, whatever his calculator choice is, and punching on it like it's a source of oxygen, right? And I find this funny, I kind of alluded to it. How hard are the first questions? Not. So I don't think the guys are going to calculators out of need so much as habit, right? And so it's a really good idea, I think, for 10th graders, and I'm sure they're doing this in class, but you can reinforce it. They should be doing some math on paper without their calculators, so that when they are put in a position like this, they aren't uncomfortable dealing with some, a little bit of arithmetic and math without their machines. In terms of scoring, by the way, you may have noticed this, ACT has several parts. They're all scored out of 36. We'll talk about that in a minute. SAT Math, 800. Verbal. The verbal parts of these tests are even more similar. And in some cases, they're even identical. For example, what I call writing, SAT calls it writing, ACT calls it English. Okay, it's basically editing. Okay, it's fixing problematic writing. Those sections are exactly the same. And not a coincidence. Like, to give you an idea, when the SAT was rewriting its exam 3 to 5 years ago, they opened an office in Iowa City, Iowa. You know what's in Iowa City, Iowa? Okay. Both right. By the way, better answers. I asked that at another school recently, and I got this like very East Coast nothing. I'm like, both right, maybe more relevant here, but yeah. So ACT's been headquartered there. SAT opens up a shop, and they start to permanently borrow ACT employees to help write their new test. So they, literally, if I showed you the two sections side by side, you couldn't tell the difference. The other thing that's identical between the two is both the ACT and SAT have an optional essay at the end of them. Have you heard anything about this? Yeah. Did your older ones write essays? Yeah? So here's the story. The essay is getting less and less important in college admissions offices, which is kind of nice. As a matter of fact, when I looked last, and feel free to correct me if I blow this, but I think there are only 15 schools that technically require the essay, 2/3 of which are part of the UC system out in California, okay? So there's a really good chance you can get to senior year, send off your college apps, and never need to show an essay. And probably that 15 will be eaten into a little bit by the time they get to 12th grade. But if you want to keep all options open, okay, sticking around to write one essay may not be a horrible idea. And this may be something that you consult college counseling with, depending on the schools you're looking at. The essays aren't hard. The hardest part of the essay is, I mentioned it, when do they give it to you? At the end. So after a 3-hour test that takes 4 hours to administer, they're like, okay, go. And so a lot of times people are out of gas. And so that ends up being something that needs to be worked on. But anyway, it's not something you need to figure out right away. It's just something to be aware of. Even for those schools that use the essay, very, very, very rare will they actually look at what a student has written. It's mostly checking off a box to make sure they did decently. Because these essays are optional, they're not part of your traditional score. So on the SAT, which goes out of 1600, it's a separate number, it's out of 24. On the ACT, which is scored out of 36, as I mentioned, it's out of 12. It just kind of sits off to the side. Any questions so far? Please.
You said, just to be clear, science and engineering majors are best at either ACT?
I did not say that. I didn't come close to saying that, so I'm glad you asked. Okay. A lot of times, so both tests are going to have about the same amount of science on them. So to me, I don't think you can necessarily draw that conclusion. But your question is really like the best question, because when you start to look at these charts, you start to think of your son, and you start to run through what he's interested in, where his strengths are, and you're gonna start to think, oh, this might be a little better, or this might be a little worse. I would try to dissuade you from doing that today. I really think the single best way to figure out which test is better is to try them both. And you can try them both in a practice setting. But for every time I think I have it figured out, I'm wrong. Like, I've been doing this forever. I can't just like interview a student to figure it out. So to me, it's all about which test feels more comfortable and which test they do better on. Really good question. Any other questions for now?
Can you say again how that essay piece figured in? Should they take it?
Sure. There's a great chance they won't need it, okay? Because there are very few colleges that require the essay. If you think you might be applying to a University of California school, or a school that you've heard is happy to see an essay, you might want to have written one. Because here's the problem. If you don't write the essay, and it's 12th grade, and you're meeting with college counseling, and you discover that a school you just fell in love with requires the essay, you have to go back in for 4.5 hours and take an entire test to write the essay. You can't, in other words, you can't just write the essay on its own. So it gets into sort of your risk quotient and how safe you want to play it. If it helps anecdotally, I have forced the guys to write these essays in the courses that I run for the first 3 years of this SAT. I stopped this spring. I don't require it anymore. I have it as an optional piece. And for even more context, my son who's an 11th grader, as mentioned, I didn't have him write the essay because I was confident he wouldn't need it. So I'm dancing around the issue because I don't want to commit here, but there's a very good likelihood you will not need to have an essay score.
But there's no bearing on score in this. It sounds like most universities, it's not a material differentiator.
No, I mentioned that one is scored out of 12 and one scored out of 24. You want to make sure that your scores are not so low as to attract attention. You don't want to be getting a 4 out of 12 or 7 out of 24. But once the score is in a reasonable range, it's going to be a shrug. Did I capture this fairly well?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I'm mostly talking about similarities between the tests. The biggest difference between the exams isn't really about what's on them. It's about the blue font, actually. I don't know if anyone noticed this.
So I thought the biggest difference all along was the time. One is a shorter exam, but then when I look at the bottom, one is a 3-hour exam, one's a 2-hour, 55-minute exam,
So the total time is like eerily identical. The difference, though, is how many questions you're answering in that time. So, for example, look at the writing comparison. On the writing, the SAT is 44 questions in 35 minutes. The ACT is 75 questions in 45 minutes. It's much faster. If you ask the kids, what most of them will say is, the ACT felt a little easier to me, but it was harder to finish. And that's pretty much dead on. There are two ways to make a test difficult. It can actually be difficult, or they just don't give you enough time. Okay? And so some students are perfectly fine just cruising through. They don't second guess themselves. They like the straightforward nature of it. They fly through it. For other students, that time pressure is too much, and it tends to lead them back to the SAT. But that's why I think trying them both is so useful, because sometimes the boys will walk out and they will know which test they prefer well before we even share a score. Right? They'll be like, I couldn't get through the reading on the ACT. Or, I felt the SAT was a little too tricky. Overall scores. SAT, 1600. Okay? ACT, 36, as I mentioned. It's an average of those four. Science, math, reading, and English. One comment about the scoring table. Does the 1600 number feel familiar
Yeah.
to all of us? Okay. Well, one thing that you will discover as you get into this process, you're going to start to look at different colleges and average scores, and you might get blown away by how high the average SAT scores are. And if you follow in the media at all, you're hearing things about how competitive college admissions is and how the percentages are all down. There are two things to keep in mind. Okay, the first is, all right, today's score out of today's 1200 is not the same as the 1200 you might have known back in 1986. Okay, so like if you have like an unhealthy competitive thing with your son, I'm just saying, keep it to yourself. But your score is not their score. And actually, if you're really competitive, I'll share this. The scores have been inflated several times over. So a 1200 back in the day would correlate to, roughly speaking, 1330 to 1360 today. So our kids are smarter, our kids are savvier. Average scores at colleges are very high, but you should absolutely keep that in mind, okay, as you deal with the process. The scoring system has been changed.
So we always talk about that. So is it that the kids are smarter, or are the grades just inflated and easier now?
Well, there are a couple of things. I'm sure they're smarter. But the bigger piece is that everything's been inflated. Average scores back in the day were in the low 900s combined. Average scores today are about 1050 or 1060.
And inflated how? Because the average is higher, or inflated because
They've just moved
you
the
get
middle line.
500 just for writing your name?
Right. So if you answered 50 questions correctly back then,
Yeah.
it might have been 1,000. If you answer 50 questions, the same 50 questions correctly now, it would be over 1,100. Okay? But there's more to it. The kids are also prepping more, right? A lot of us just walked in. The other thing to keep in mind with college admissions, and you all can speak to this far better than I, is that each individual person is submitting many more applications now. And so, yes, kids are savvier and better prepared and more impressive, but they're also just literally filing more virtual paperwork than we would have. For a number of reasons, including the fact that completing applications online is so much easier now than it was back in the day with, whiteout. Okay? So, that gives you a sense of the scoring. Friend sent me this in the fall. It's testing humor. It's not that funny, but it's not bad. But this is kind of my point. You don't want to pick your test based on some fact you picked up somewhere, something a friend told you at a party. Just like you don't want to pick a college based on a great tour guide or a really incompetent one. This slide I should have included in your packet. This just sums up where we've been about the two tests. That they share more than they don't. Both are meant to test high school content. Both are multiple choice. Neither involves a guessing penalty. And each exam includes an optional essay. The only real differences tend to be how the science is organized, right? In a separate section versus scattered, and the pacing. So, for scores, all of your guys took the PSAT in the fall, right? And they'll take it again this summer. If at any point they want to compare to see how they're doing on the test, they can use these kinds of concordance tables. And these are particularly helpful if you're used to SAT scoring but not ACT scoring, right? If you go online to find one of these, just make sure you're using a recent chart, because these are updated every couple of years. This is the most recent version from 2018. Here's my advice with using one of these tables. I would use them literally, but not rigidly. So for example, let's say you took a practice test and you scored a 1310 on a PSAT. It's a good score. Okay? And a 28 on the ACT. What does that say?
Consistent testing.
Yes. I'm not trying to Joe Blogs you here. There's no trick. Okay? If you give a 1310 and a 28, it's pretty much dead comparable. But I would extend this a little bit. Meaning, if I had a 27 and a 1310, what would I say to that?
It's comparable.
It's the same. Okay? Or a 29 and a 1310, also. But if you start to look at tables like these, and you have a student who's got 2 or 3 or more gradations of difference, okay? If you're talking about like 1430 versus 28, then it's pretty clear you've found a student who does meaningfully better on one test over the other. Roughly a third of the students I see are in that boat. About 2/3 score exactly the same, and for that reason get mad at me for pushing them to try both. But the reality is I can't figure it out until they actually try. Okay? So this is kind of a useful thing to do. You can do it with the real scores or the practice ones like the PSAT. Questions before I keep rolling? Please.
Back to your comments on vocabulary.
Yep.
So, inferring from what you said, that there's probably, or that there's not a need to, as we did, study long lists of words any longer, and that it's, if your son is, describe it, but that his vocabulary, the typical vocabulary for an 11th grader is what the test is now geared towards, and not these words that no one uses.
Correct.
So there should be no preparation focus in that way.
Memorizing vocabulary is just not part of the equation anymore. The only word piece, when they do ask about vocabulary, it's usually done in context. So it tends to connect more to how well they read versus what their incoming vocabulary knowledge is.
Do you know that you have taken away the only reason my son has been given to take it? Is that this will help him understand?
My only problem with what you just said is that you said you. I had nothing to do with it, but yes. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and you're right. And what's really amazing is you realize how much power the College Board has on what's learned in the classroom. The truth is the newer tests are meant to align better with what kids learn in school. There is a greater alignment between high school experience and testing. That's good. But the elimination of the vocabulary contributes to the downfall of Latin. Yeah, absolutely. There was another one, yeah.
You're going to cover this later, but if you were going to do a tutoring, when does that start? Should they be in capital educators right now?
How early?
How early does this begin?
Here we are.
Okay.
Okay, so I want to be really clear, there's no right answer for this. This really has to do with your son's schedule and your son's level of motivation, okay? And just kind of what works for you all as a family. I'll start with this, just as one piece. They're all going to take the PSAT again in October, okay? That's just a Wednesday morning in October. It'll happen here. Like in 10th grade, the PSAT plays no direct role in admissions at all. Colleges never see the exact scores, ever, okay? The only thing that PSAT is connected to is college marketing in most cases. Are you guys getting mail like we are? I tried to recommend my son not complete that survey, but he did, and so, right? It just keeps coming. The PSAT's value is, it's a pretty accurate indicator of what your student would get on an SAT on that same day. But it's still completely for practice, okay? There are a few students every year for whom the PSAT has value. If you do extremely well, it's still connected to the National Merit Scholarship Program, okay? But I'm talking about scoring in the top 1% or half of 1% for that to be the case. As a matter of fact, if scholarship money is even in your head, there's much more scholarship money connected to actual performance on the real SAT. So like if you gave me a choice, there's no comparison. You want your student to do well on the SAT, not only for admission, but also potentially for scholarships. So anyway, that date is locked. But other than that date, you guys as families can decide when to sit for these things. 3 blocks of time. There are fall tests that run through December, first semester tests. There are second semester tests, mostly from February to May. And then there are 12th grade tests, okay? At school, the earliest we typically recommend the guys test is December of 11th grade. And for that reason, I do run my course here on campus in the fall, from October till December, leading right up until that test date, okay? But if that's a bad time for your student because of a fall sport or any other commitment, testing in the second semester is not only fine, it's actually even more common regionally, okay? And I've tried to show you that the tests alternate every month. So what most students do after they've prepped with me is they will take both. They'll sit for an SAT and an ACT within a few weeks of one another, and then we collect those scores. Ideally, you get to the end of 11th grade, maybe not having hit your dream score, but at least having done reasonably well, so that when you are looking at colleges a year from now and the following summer, you're visiting schools with real scores banked and not hypothetical ones, right? Yeah.
Do they still have that requirement that you have to decide before you take the test whether this will be submitted to a college or not?
Okay. Yes and no. The yes part is when you sign up to take any of these tests, if your son does that or if you do that collectively, at the end of the registration process, they'll give you an option to send your scores for free to 4 colleges. You guys may vaguely remember this. What do you think about that? Yeah, we probably don't want to take advantage of that for a number of reasons, including the fact that we don't know if that test is going to be one we ultimately want to show. I think this also takes a little bit of pressure off the guys. We can say, look, this matters. You need to get your sleep, and you need to eat your breakfast, you need to be ready. But if you don't have your best day, there's a good chance we just will not report it. There's also a trend now, there's much more self-reporting of scores too, from what I understand. So anyway, the short of it is, you take these tests, and typically in the fall of 12th grade, you're figuring out what scores go to what institutions. Yeah?
Okay, so I take the SAT 2 times, or 3 times. Do I choose, or do they always send the highest, or do they average them?
Super score. Have you heard of this expression?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's say in 11th grade, a student takes the SAT. Okay? All right? And he earns a 1240. Okay? And he's pretty pleased with that, although he really wanted both scores to at least be in the 600s. So he spends the summer reading. Okay? No phone, just reading. That's amazing. Takes the thing again, and his verbal score does improve, but the math understandably drops a little bit. What almost every school in the country will do now on SAT, almost, is this super scoring thing, which means you send them both days, and they will mix and match the highest numbers they can find. So even though at first it looked like that second test was a waste of time, you actually do pick up 60 points through superscoring. Okay? There's some cases where you don't even have to send both, and you just send them your super scores, and they'll do it that way. But this has become the norm, and you might be able to guess why. Why do you think this is what most colleges do now?
They want to report higher scores.
Yes. Cynical, but accurate. Yeah. It helps colleges. Colleges are able to say, well, our freshmen are coming in with average scores of here. From a student's perspective, it's nice because it allows us a couple of opportunities to mix and match our best numbers and to put our best foot forward. What I don't love about it is, I don't love that sometimes this makes people test and retest and retest and retest. And that's where, if you work with someone like me or a tutor or you're using college counseling, just be wise about how often you put your kids through this. Because testing, again, is a great idea if there are actually points to be gained. But if they've come pretty darn close to maxing out, sometimes it's a much better idea to spend your time doing something else, like school. Okay?
Is the ACT the same, like if the 4 different sections, or is it different with the SAT and the ACT?
That's a perfect question. So SAT, almost all of them do this. As a matter of fact, University of California doesn't do this. That's another UC thing. ACT is super scored much more rarely. There are about 175 schools that super score the ACT. You can find this out once it's time, website by website as you're doing your search. And every year more schools are added to that list. But I think part of it is that the ACT has 4 sections, so super scoring tends to kind of skew the data more than 2.
So, I seem to recall that a student took the SAT twice, did really well in one of the sections, wanted to take it again in the other section. Let's say the math was, 780 or something. And verbal was, I don't know.
610.
Yeah, exactly. Were they able to go in and just take the
No.
verbal?
You can't take these tests a la carte. You have to sit for the whole thing. But you're making a point. It's fairly common for a student to test the first time and be happy with at least 1 score. And that's still good. That means before he sits for that second one, he can focus on the verbal. He can care more about the verbal. The only thing I would never recommend is taking the real test and taking a nap during the math. Like, most schools are not going to care if your math drops. They're just going to mix and match the highest numbers. I just wouldn't want a 660 to become a 420 and to basically beg an admissions office, right, to pay attention and say, he's trying to game the system. So you have to sit for the 4 hours, but you can combine, the 2 best marks.
Are you going to talk about the subject test?
Sure. Let me go back to the timeline for that. So let me finish talking about the timing of the main test, and then we'll absolutely take subject tests. So most students I see will have taken maybe 2 tests in 11th grade, maybe 1 of each, or maybe 2 of the same. And they're usually in pretty good shape at the end of 11th grade, like we were saying. But almost everyone will test again in this band of dates here, between July and October, okay? And you could probably relate to this as the parents of the boys, okay? 6 to 9 months, okay, in their lives is actually a significant amount of time, okay? Like, their brains are developing, they're maturing, they're reading more, at least in school, okay? They're improving. 6 to 9 months for us, right? We know that. It's a slow fade. I just had a big birthday, so I'm a little sensitive. So in a lot of cases, the guys come in 12th grade without even having done as much prep as I'd like, as much refresher study as I'd like, and they do better. They're older. And sometimes it's also because college is more real, right? You get to like August before 12th grade, they're going to be feeling it much more than in December of 11th grade. So unless they've hit it out of the park as juniors, probably they're going in one more time to take either an ACT or an SAT, whichever format we think is better, sometime between the summer and the fall. Summer test dates are a new phenomenon. They've only been around a couple of years. There's an ACT in July, very few people take. There's an SAT at the end of August, right before school starts. There's an ACT at the beginning of September. Those are the most popular, usually like right before 12th grade gets more intense with schoolwork. So it's April of sophomore year. This probably isn't over for another year and a half, which means you want to be really wise about when you start this. In terms of when to start, I would just give you this much info. Whatever test date you think makes sense is great, but keep in mind that whatever test date you pick probably means starting to study in some way, shape, or form a couple months in advance. Okay? In my experience, most students should spend between 2 and 4 dozen hours on this to kind of get into a reasonable range that mirrors where they should be.
Can you say that again?
2 to 4 dozen hours. I use dozen because I thought it might sound less painful than 25 to 50 hours. That's a lot of time, but I think if it's planned intelligently, it doesn't have to define their lives at all. Okay? There are many, many ways to do the prep, including free and very inexpensive prep on your own. These tests are not mysterious. They never were really all that mysterious, but with every update, they become even more transparent. In under 30 seconds, you can find official practice tests online. Both the ACT and SAT also have these online videos. You know, College Board has partnered with Khan Academy. Hundreds of SAT videos. Fun. ACT, not so creatively, has their own academy called ACT Academy. And both institutions have books that you can find pretty darn quickly online. The key, if they are going to study on their own, you want to get books that have official in the title, because if they're going to do a few practice tests, they should be from the real source and not from facsimiles. SAT, ACT. All right. And by the way, if you do finish your testing by the beginning of October of senior year, your testing is all in well before they should need it for even the earliest of applications. Okay? The truth is you can keep testing all the way through December, but in our universe, most people are wrapping up by the first week in October. All right. Subject test? Okay, have you heard of these? You have a question of SAT first? All right, one more, and then I promise. Yes?
What's the correlation between practice tests that you would administer at Capital versus actual results that the students achieve when they take the test?
Hours are dead on, but that's because we spend, hundreds of hours writing the tests and refining them. We give practice exams every 2 weeks for the students who take our courses. What we found is scores on our final test are within 20 points of real SAT scores. Usually the kids do a tiny bit better on the real day. Mostly because I think the adrenaline tends to help our sons more than hurt them. But yeah, it's dead on. That's why if you are going to buy a book on your own, I would not buy a book of tests that was written by a prep company, because sometimes those exams are too easy or too difficult. And there are so many real exams out there, there's no reason to use the facsimiles. All right, I owe you an answer here, so I'll go there. So, I don't have it listed, I should. How many of you have heard of subject tests? If it helps, these were called achievement tests when we were in high school. Okay? They are 1-hour exams offered in pretty much every subject imaginable. So, math, science, foreign language, history, literature. They're only 1 hour each. Okay? There are very few schools that technically require these now. Okay? I think they're like 4 that require them. That's it. And most of those 4 are math science institutions, okay? But some of the most competitive colleges will recommend these or indicate that they'll consider them. Because they're subject tests, they directly connect to what they're learning in school. That's typically the prep. And in the grand scheme of things, they are much less important than what we've been talking about this morning. But here's where they kind of matter. You want to make sure that you capitalize on the timing for those. Like, when do you think most students would be ready to take a test about what they're doing in school? What month? May or June. You got it. So one reason that so much SAT and ACT testing occurs from November to May is so that June is there free in case they want to take subject tests. Okay? Because they're only 1 hour each, you can take 2 of them in one sitting. You could even take 3, although that's pretty rare. Okay? But the bottom line is this. If they're taking an advanced class, studying well for it, taking exams in it, okay, there's a really good chance that they can just slide right in and take a subject test. You don't start manufacturing hours out of your life just for a subject test. But you want to take it when the knowledge is fresh, because most students are not going to remember that material from 10th grade or from 11th grade into the fall of 12th. You can typically take any subject test topic you'd like, but if you are looking into engineering or science, you probably do want to take a math and a science, probably. But generally speaking, you just want to take ones you're going to do well on. The single easiest way to figure out if a subject test makes sense, in my opinion, you can do a lot of things. You can talk to college counselor. You probably know offhand which subject tests are most popular here. What do most of the guys take?
Latin, history.
Chemistry.
So there's institutional knowledge. The teachers often know whether they've been teaching to that test at all or whether they couldn't care less. But in the end, honestly, this is really easy to do. You can find a book with the word official in the title. This is for subject tests, the official study guide for subject tests. You sit down in April or May for 1 hour. You try the math 2 or the chemistry. You score it. It's scored out of 800 points. You'll know really quickly whether that test is a good fit or a horrible idea. And if it's a bad idea, so what? Just let it go, okay? But this way you at least capitalize on the moment. Usually it's the end of 11th grade when students take these.
Is it similar in that if you take the subject test and you don't do well on it, it doesn't have to be submitted if you don't want it?
You can almost always shield it. But I would only take it if you knew you were going to do reasonably well. Just why take the chance? And actually, that's a good macro point on the real SAT as well. I don't believe in taking the real SAT as like a lab experiment. Like, I think there are enough ways to take practice tests on your own or with groups like mine that you can take a simulated one without having to go through the real thing before you're ready.
So if our boys are taking EuroCiv right now and there's a subject test, are they broken down into European history, American history? Should they be, if they're A students in EuroCiv, should they be taking the subject test at the end of the year?
So they are broken down into US versus world. I don't know how many sophomores end up taking histories from what you guys are seeing.
Not seeing very many.
No,
But
most
if
people-
it's-
In most cases, they have enough time in junior year to take the number of subject tests that they need.
But if it's content-based and EuroCiv is fresh in their mind now, would it make more sense for them to take it now versus after a year of American history?
Oh, 100%, yeah. You don't want to
They
take
should be taking,
you don't want to take the world at the end of US.
right, so we should be taking it.
I might at least try one for an hour. And by the way, if you have trouble finding a real test, I have tons of them on file. You can just email me and I'll be happy to send you one. I should have included my email and contact on the first page of the slides there, if you do have individual questions. I feel like you had a subject test question. Do you have a question?
Does how do you get all the tests for including SAT, SAT subject test, everything?
Usually, you can select what scores to show. Usually. So they don't automatically see everything. Okay? However, let's only have them test when they're ready. We don't want them earning a score prematurely, right? We don't want them going in before they've done their study. Okay. Yep.
Can you talk about the different preparation options? So from doing nothing to what the extremes are and what's in the middle?
Sure. So I mentioned like that number of hours range, right? So keep that in the back of your mind. There are three main ways to prep, right? One way is to self-study. And if you do buy the books or work online and take a practice test or two on your own, and you're reasonably happy with where you're starting out, you're going to be much closer to that 25 hours than the 50 hours. Self-study can absolutely work if your guys are obviously motivated enough to do it, but also you want to make sure that self-study is done in a thoughtful way. What I sometimes worry about is students will be good about doing practice, and they'll mark up what they got wrong, but if they don't spend time afterwards thoughtfully reviewing what they missed, connecting the dots, and finding a pattern to their mistakes, they're not going to see a significant benefit, right? It's kind of like hitting your head against the wall. You're just going to keep practicing the same way. So I guess those are the two challenges to it. Having the discipline and being smart about that practice. There are a lot of people out there who do private tutoring. My group doesn't. We only do group work. Tutoring is great. You can schedule it when you want. You get personal attention. But as a couple of us were talking about earlier, sometimes a challenge with the tutoring is like the self-study. Even if you work with a really knowledgeable tutor, you have to do significant homework between those weekly meetings for it to add up to anything. And you know what I mean? It's not like you just have that material dispensed during your 1 hour and you're done. It takes a while to change your test-taking habits. So if a student's good about doing the 2 or 3 hours of homework in between, it can often work great. I do small group classes, including the course here at school. And not to self-promote, but I may have brought schedules with me, in case you're curious. But my attitude's different with it. I work with the guys for longer periods of time in a structured, supervised way. So they've come to us for 4 hours at a time. We spend 2 hours on math, 2 hours on verbal. I group them according to their scores and their strengths into small classes. But the big idea is we teach them and they practice with us. So there's almost no homework on their own. Okay? So you have to kind of know your own learning style. In the end, I think if it's just mapped out intelligently, any of those three ways works perfectly well. I'm biased toward mine. I don't want to keep you much longer. Are there any other general questions? And then I'm happy to stick around for individual ones.
So suppose I want to do the self-study, how do you score written tests? So
The essay? Couple possibilities. The easiest is you can actually submit your essay to College Board and Khan Academy electronically, and they'll score it. Like you'll have to wait, but you can send your essay and get it scored. And there are also people in the area and teachers and tutors who can do that for you. And marking up the multiple choice, that's easy. That's no problem. It's a good question. Yeah.
So based on that timetable that you have up there, do people go into the group study format more than once, or is it really you dive into that and then you're taking a test, maybe retake a test, but you're done?
Great question. So most of the people I see will work with me intensively for 2 months. Okay? Take the test, see a significant jump. And then if they decide to retest, which is pretty common, we invite them back for light refresher work. Usually just on those areas that are troubling them. Every once in a while, if I have someone who really needs more work and will not do any practice on his own, we have a full second refresher course they can do as a second cycle. But I'd say more than 3/4 of our students are doing it once with a tiny bit of touch-up.
And what does the touch-up mean? Like, if do you hope that they'll still come in on group classes, or what is the touch-up?
Always more practice testing with us that we'll score and analyze. Sometimes additional classes in the areas that are giving them trouble. And sometimes a little bit of one-on-one time with one of the directors if they need to. We customize that based on how far we go.
Can you quantify results, like on average, what's the jump in scores? Because, we have talked to some people like, hey, we'll guarantee a certain jump in points for a certain amount of money.
Sure. I would definitely be a little wary of guaranteeing anything. Not to belittle anyone's preparation, but in the end, it also comes down to how well the guys perform that day. I can tell you this, our median improvement at the end of a 2-month course is right around 80 points per subject on SAT. So about 160. Half the students exceeded, half were a little below. Almost everyone improves between 100 and 200 points in that first cycle. After that, it's a conversation as to how many more points there might be, and whether it's even worth, doing more. But it's funny, I've tutored all these versions of the test, and we keep getting almost the exact same improvement, no matter what the changes are. So that tends to be about the sweet spot for most people. That said, too, your students' sophomore PSATs should improve a lot. When I'm talking about improvements, I'm not comparing them to the beginning of 10th grade. So if you have any memory of how he did, okay, even without quality prep, those scores are going to dramatically improve, because between October of 10th grade and October of senior year, they're different people. So just something.
Do you cover or have a comment about AP tests?
APs?
APs that you recommend taking, not taking, is it?
Well, that really gets into your territory here. I don't know how the degree to which students are taking APs and what's sort of normal.
That's okay, if it's not relevant to your presentation, that's it.
But much like subject tests, the AP exams are measuring your achievement over the course of the entire year. The value in the AP score is that you can place out of certain classes. Sometimes you can get college credit, but it also is a way of corroborating that A, you earned all year meant a lot. The truth is, going to a school like Gilman, the colleges understand the rigor of the curriculum going in. This is one of the schools in our area that any admissions officer is going to know.
Might go back to that slide that had the ACT and the SAT scores.
Sure.
Columns. So I want to try to understand the difference in the numbers. If I'm an admissions director looking at the numbers, what's all of the things being equal for applicants? What's the delta that they're looking for? One's for the other, where there's a significant difference in ACT or SAT scores?
Okay, just in terms of comparing them.
Right. So not to say that this is going to be an absolute number to get into a school, but if I have 2 applicants, it is 100 points different. Going to make a difference when an applicant versus 300. What's the delta that?
Yeah, I would say using SAT points as because that's a little bit easier for us to speak to. I would say when you're well north of 50 points, there's meaning to it. So if you were 70 plus points different, you're onto something. But if you're within 50, it's often a shrug. What you'll discover, maybe more usefully when you start looking at colleges, is that most schools will publish online scores from the 25th to 75th percentiles, okay? Where the middle 50 are. And generally speaking, if you find yourself solidly in that range, you're in comfortable territory. Let me kind of end with this. You've heard of test optional, right? Okay. So going super macro, okay? The scores matter. I wouldn't spend all my time doing it if I didn't think they mattered, okay? But if it's a choice between grades and scores, your 4-year record is much more meaningful than your performance on a 4-hour test, okay? That's a fact. There are 1,100 plus schools around the country that don't even require these exams. Our starting point is not these schools, right? Our starting point is to keep all our options open. But But the reality, big picture is, for most guys, their scores are rarely the thing that gets them in. You're mostly looking to get scores into that reasonable range. You want them to be at a level where the scores generally match the grades, and where a college shrugs its shoulders and says, yep, that makes sense. The truth is, we're really trying to avoid just having one number be the deal breaker. And you shouldn't worry that current scores, as I said, like 10th grade PSATs, don't match your son's grades. That's how it is for almost everybody. Like every phone call at our office starts with, my son is this student, comma, but not a great. Can you finish it? You're good, okay. I'm like, where are the great test takers? Because I've never heard of them. But that's because it's a really rare student who at 15, okay, is going to take a test he's never seen before and walk out of it with a top number that matches his A- average at school. It's just not going to happen. But because these things improve on a scale of hundreds of points, okay, it's not where they are now. It's just being able to see that we can get them in now these places. Anything I missed or you want to add?
Thank you so much, Phil.
Okay.
When Phil put up that math problem in the beginning, I could just feel myself filled with anxiety. And that was definitely the weakest part of my SAT. And it just made me think, I've got to pay attention to those feelings. Maybe this is what the boys are feeling too. And then as you spoke, and as you kind of filled this room with your knowledge and experience, I could feel that anxiety subside. And I think that's what we're here to offer, our students, is, kind of this expertise and holding them in that place to help them do their best work. So thank you for your experience and sharing with us today. We're very grateful.
Thanks for having me.
And we will post this video online, and if I could share your handout, is that your PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll share it with those who weren't able to come. Please know that our doors are open. My doors are certainly open. I'm especially at this point in the year, we're meeting with juniors, but if anyone has any other questions, would like to meet one-on-one, feel free to contact me, and I'd be happy to sit down with you and kind of talk this through. And I guess Phil's available to answer questions as well around testing, and thank you for being here this morning. And we'll hang around if anybody has some questions to ask us one-on-one. Thank you.
I'll leave these out. Thanks, guys.